Welcome. This is part 1 of The Return of Mandy Mae, a Helbrook Spirit-verse story. Chapter 1, The Heart House. Jess May sat on the edge of her porch on Fiery Road, feet dangling above the dry dirt, watching the wind turn the clouds like soup in a black pot as she waited for night. She looked deep into the sky at the whirling, unsettled horizon. Heavy clouds reaching out like clawed fingers scoring the heavens. It had been an evening like that, on the day after Mandy's funeral. Back then she hadn't spoken to anyone in days. Not properly, not since the end of Mandy Mae, and she didn't need to either. Everywhere she went she was followed by sorrowful glances and mournful whispers. All their solemn condolences balled up and choked her in the back of her throat like a chicken's craw, sour and undigested. Tragedy came about every so often in Helbrook, but not as frequently as the strange things that plagued the town. Everyone who lived there had escaped some horrific cosmic terror or destiny, so their ability to adapt was stronger than most. Helbrook seemed like a raw deal, but it was actually a compromise between the extinction of their old, secular lives and the eldritch horrors that had ripped them clean out of any sense of normalcy. The townsfolk had declared the case closed. They had whispered their thanks to Detective Escoy. Mandy Mae was gone, and according to most, good riddance. A big sigh of relief had fallen over Helbrook then, but Jess and her parents felt like a snag in a silken robe. Everyone wanted to do what they always did after a Helbrook phenomena. Keep calm and move on, forget. The Easter parade disappearances, the floating dolls, the eye in the church bell tower, it all vanished when she did. As far as Helbrook was concerned, the girl had been a cancer, but she wasn't always the terrorizer of May. Before that she was her sister, a dream of their lives before the waking nightmare that brought them to Helbrook. Back then everything for Jess was in free fall, but painfully slow. She could see everything caked together like a concrete slab heading straight for her. It was her fault. Jess had known it. She still knew it. She was her big sister. If she hadn't picked up that damned wooden pipe, they'd still be living their lives as intended. Jess's parents tried to hold her close, tried to cook her meals and sit beside her at night. But grief was an isolating illness, and Jess couldn't even begin to know how to start. She couldn't even sleep, let alone live or breathe easily. Every exhale caught in her throat, her heartbeat tangled in a web of anxiety. There was no comfort to be had. Instead, she'd been planning. When another restless night had befallen her, she'd walk until her knees creaked. The boundaries of Helbrook shifted if you knew how to look. You'd have to have lived there for a while, though, unless you went out past curfew, looking for trouble. There were doors that weren't doors and paths no map would hold. She found an iron gate behind the burnt barn off Dead Drop Road, a red river that didn't reflect the moon. A woman made of crows who told her, Miz Hail does seize all life in hell. At first Jess was deeply fearful, twisted in tense knots, when she went out after curfew. The night never carried a bite of cold, but she would have her arms wrapped tightly about her like cling film. The people you'd see during the day were near unrecognizable at night. And then there was the Hell community that only appeared at night. They'd all stare her down, frowning, watching with their beady dark eyes at the outsider. She would search aimlessly for information, but no one would talk to her, and even though they watched her, no one would acknowledge her either. Then she came across Ojera and her crew. The girl was a little older, a detective of sorts. She took Jess under her wing, and in her embrace Ojera helped Jess light up the night. And after the 10th stroll out at night, she'd become thoroughly embraced by the night population. Ogier took her on wild adventures, showed her the wonderful side of Helbrook, and over time Jess felt herself become lighter, effervescent, and transparent. The raging concrete that was insistently moving towards her meant nothing. She gained so much confidence and experience she felt herself moving through it intact. Then Jess, with her new-found autonomy, began to understand her surroundings. Helbrook finally started to feel like home, well, at night. Then Jess began to use the skills she'd developed from her time with Ogier and her crew. The night hell crowd didn't ignore her anymore. They even called her name. Jess chased down leads, followed rumors and unraveled dreams, until finally she found herself in front of the Heart House. It was said that it stood at the town's major pivot, where roads cracked and moss grew through gravel. It seemed entirely abandoned, definitely the least populated part of Helbrook. But even so, it was still the epicenter of the entire town. It moved frequently, though. That much Jess had surmised. Any time she'd come across it, the journey there had never been the same. The windows were bricked, the door painted over in white lye. The air smelled like mint and mildew. He knocked once. A voice, low and humming, answered, "At long last. You're late. But you've made your way here, haven't you?" "I'm here to bring someone back," Jess whispered. "My sister." The door creaked inward. Inside was silence pressed like cotton to the ears. The walls breathed. A single figure stood at the center, long as a shadow stretched by a dying sun. Miz Hail. She wore a dress made of memory, hair like rushing river water. No eyes, no mouth, but Jess could hear her voice in the space behind her thoughts. Within a blink of an eye, Miz Hail had transformed. She appeared as a woman in a long soiled robe and stood before Jess. Vanished was the creature only present a moment ago. Well, in appearance anyway. It was only a matter of time when you would journey your way to me. "I've seen your house before." "Yes, but no matter how close the Heart House appears, everyone seeking it takes the long winding path to get here." "Fine, whatever," Jess said curtly, tapping her foot. "You are young," said Miz Hail, "and young ones ask for impossible things." "Why her?" "Because I dunno, she's my little sister." "That means nothing to me. Mandy was not born here." "Yes," Jess hissed. "And she wouldn't have been here in the first place if I'd never found that stupid flute." "That too matters not." Jess stomped her foot and groaned. "Bring her back." "Please, you have to." "I do not." Jess's voice didn't shake. "Because if anyone deserves a second chance, it's her. I care not. Please, I will give anything. Make this right." Miz Hail said nothing for a long time. "Then you've come this far, sorority of May. You may walk the winding path as deep as necessary to achieve your goal, or until your soul cannot stand it any longer." Jess stopped her foot tapping and gathered herself. "How do I start?" A too wide smile cracked across the disheveled woman's face. "Child of May, you've already begun. But I don't know how I'm supposed to. You may carry her echo." Miz Hail reached out a palm, laying it flat against the air and lining it up with Jess's forehead. Jess took a deep breath, then closed her eyes. "That's it," said Miz Hail, project. "All that is her onto my robes of becoming, make her a dream. Be the shape." Jess knitted her eyebrows together as she tried to concentrate, sweat beading up above her brow. Now let the dream bloom, tie it to this reality. Put it all into the shape. Jess began to feel her head float away as her body began to burn up and the floor felt like it had suddenly fallen away. But even so, she rooted herself to that spot. The beating in her chest made its way up through the tension in her neck and into her head. Her skull felt made of lid, and her temples throbbed like a dull drill trying to catch ground. Jess cried out, squeezing her eyelids, teeth gnashing together. "It is done." Jess collapsed onto the wood floor and began to pant, trying desperately to catch her breath. She grabbed her throat to support it as she struggled to suck air in, an acid gurgle in the back of her throat. Jess spluttered, trying to get words out between coughs. When her body had finally begun to settle, she looked up and saw suspended in the air above Miz Hail's palm was an orb. Jess pulled herself to her feet and swiped it out of the air and looked at it. There were colorful blurs over a dull, smooth surface. Jess couldn't quite make out the scenery, but she recognized one shape as her baby sister, Mandy. The woman in the soiled dress recoiled. "Take it, use it," said Miz Hail. "The vision in the orb will become clearer and brighter the closer you get." "Where do I start?" The woman chuckled, and it caught Jess by surprise. For a moment she could have mistaken her for the average local. "I've told you. You have already begun. This is your winding road." The woman turned towards an open door past the stairwell, instantly bursting into a flutter of red doves that quickly dispersed through the house walls, splashing liquidated plaster and paint everywhere. The house began to rumble like a deeper, more solemn note of Miz Hail's laughter. A wind like thunder splashed through the ceiling, and Jess dove out the way, crashing through the door behind her. She tried to regain her footing, but the cobbled path she'd walked to the house was now a wet, grassy slope that dipped sharply into a dark chasm. Jess dropped awkwardly onto the ground, down the hillside, feet and legs overhead. She only stopped when she crashed into a cluster of rocks. Jess spat out a loud, bloated grunt before all going black. When Jess awoke, she cried out, unable to move. When she tried, an intense stabbing pain ripped its way through her. Her shoulders seemed compacted and slack, and she was getting a rush of tingling and numbness. She tried to move again, growling like a wounded animal. Tears swelled in her eyes as she repositioned her shoulder between a pair of rocks. She hyperventilated, pumping and sucking in air rapidly as she prepared herself for what she needed to do. And when the tingling had dissipated and the numbness settled in, now... "Ah! Ah!" Jess screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice carrying over the trees, setting a flock of black birds to flight. She went limp. The next time Jess awoke, her arm and shoulder were covered in a big angry bruise, but the pain was less and she'd regained use of her limb. More tears poured out from her eyes, not from any strong emotions, just pain. Her mind was already working on what she needed to do next. Jess climbed to her feet as carefully as she could, staggering for a tense beat, as the weight of her mind fluttered off for a moment. She caught herself. Jess removed her plaid top and began to use her other arm and foot to tear it apart. When it was roughly elongated, she quickly fashioned a sling and put her injured limb into it. Jess pulled her phone out of her pocket. The screen was completely destroyed, but it still lit up well enough for her to navigate her surroundings and look for the orb. Luckily, it didn't take long. Jess carefully took in her surroundings once she had located the orb. When she held it, the brightness and clarity changed. She decided to climb back up to the heart house. By the time she worked her way back up there, she could only witness what was left of the house crumble away into the wind as fine ash. Jess stood on a barren grassy hill, realizing it was the highest peak. She saw that she stood surrounded by a forest she'd never seen before. It was thick with fog and trees that wept converging puddles of red sap. Jess gripped the orb tightly in her hand and stretched her arm up to the sky. The orb flashed into life with a bright layered whooshing sound. Somewhere ahead, Mandy's soul waited. That was chapter 1 of The Return of Mandy Mae, Don't forget to like and subscribe, please. See you in the next one.